They were the symbols of pure, messy childhood joy, a gang of scruffy kids who made the whole world laugh during its darkest days. But for many of the Little Rascals, the final curtain call wasn't met with applause. It was met with violence, addiction, and freak accidents. How did the most famous children in America end up in such dark places? From mysterious shootings to medical nightmares, we're uncovering the tragic reality behind the Our Gang curse. The laughter ends here. It all starts with the boy behind the most famous cowlick in history, Carl Alfalfa Switzer. The shot heard round Hollywood. When you think of the Little Rascals, the first image that probably pops into your head is a skinny kid with a cracking voice and a gravity-defying cowlick. Carl Switzer, known to the world as Alfalfa, was the undisputed breakout star of the sound era of Our Gang. He was the romantic lead, the crooner, and the comedic heartbeat of the group. But while Alfalfa was busy serenading Darla on screen, the real Carl Switzer was developing a reputation for being a bit of a troublemaker. He was known for playing mean-spirited pranks on set, sometimes even putting fish hooks in the other kids' pockets, or lighting firecrackers in places they shouldn't be. It seemed like there was a restless, aggressive energy in Carl that the cameras just couldn't quite capture. As he grew out of his childhood fame, that energy didn't dissipate. It curdled into a life that was increasingly erratic and, ultimately, violent. By the time the 50s rolled around, the fame had dried up. Carl was no longer the darling of the silver screen. He was a man struggling to find his footing in a world that only saw him as a former child star. He took odd jobs, worked as a hunting guide, and did some bit parts in movies. But the steady paycheck and the adoration were gone. The transition from being one of the most recognizable faces in the world to being a guy just trying to make ends meet is a psychological bridge. Many child stars failed to cross, and Carl was no exception. He began to lean into a rougher lifestyle, one that involved a lot of drinking and a short fuse. The curse of the Little Rascals often starts with Carl because his death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a brutal, unnecessary confrontation that felt like something out of a gritty noir film rather than a family comedy. The events leading up to his death are almost absurdly small-scale, which makes the outcome even more haunting. It all started with a hunting dog. Carl had borrowed a dog from a man named Moses Bud Stilts. When the dog went missing, Carl put up a reward. Eventually, the dog was found, and Carl paid the finder $35 and bought them $15 worth of drinks. In Carl's mind, he was out $50 because of Stilts's dog, and he wanted that money back. On the night of January 21st, 1959, a heavily intoxicated Carl Switzer and a friend headed over to Stilts's home in Mission Hills to collect. What started as a verbal argument quickly escalated into a physical brawl. Carl allegedly smashed a clock over Stilts's head, and things spiraled out of control. According to Stilts's testimony, Carl brandished a hunting knife and threatened to kill him. In the heat of the struggle, Stilts grabbed a .38 caliber revolver. A shot was fired, and Carl Switzer was hit in the groin. He bled out and was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. He was only 31 years old. For years, the story was told as a case of justifiable homicide. But later, accounts from witnesses suggested that Carl might have been trying to retreat when the fatal shot was fired. Regardless of the legal technicalities, the image of Alfalfa, the sweet, singing boy, lying on a kitchen floor over a $50 dispute about a dog, became the foundational legend of the Little Rascals curse. It was a violent, messy end that stripped away the last remnants of the show's innocence. But was Carl just an isolated case of a kid who couldn't grow up? Or was there something more sinister following the gang? William Buckwheat Thomas, the boy who couldn't escape the shadow. If Alfalfa was the voice of the gang, Buckwheat was the heart, with those wide eyes and the iconic messy hair. William Thomas became a pop culture legend before he even hit puberty. He was in more Our Gang shorts than almost anyone else, appearing in nearly 100 episodes. On screen, he was the lovable kid who always seemed to be in the middle of the chaos, often paired with Stymie or Porky. But off-screen, William was a different person entirely. He was quiet, professional, and actually quite shy. When the cameras stopped rolling and the series finally ended in 1944, William didn't fight for the spotlight like Carl Switzer did. He didn't spiral into a life of crime or chase the ghost of his former fame. Instead, he did something that many fans found shocking. He just walked away. He enlisted in the United States Army, served his country, and then came back to Los Angeles to live a normal life as a film technician and editor. For a long time, it looked like William was going to be the one who beat the curse by simply ignoring it. He had a steady job at Technicolor, he was well-liked by his colleagues, and he rarely talked about his days as a child star. He wasn't bitter, he just moved on. But the problem with being a child star is that the world rarely lets you move on. Even as he worked behind the scenes, people would recognize him, and he'd have to deal with the baggage of a character that some people in the later civil rights era began to criticize as a stereotype. William always defended the show, saying the kids were just having fun, and that they were all treated equally on set. But the pressure of that legacy was always there, simmering in the background. It's a lot of weight for a man to carry when he's just trying to live a quiet life and provide for his family. The tragedy of William Buckwheat Thomas isn't a story of violence or a dramatic fall from grace like Alfalfa's. It's a story of a life cut far too short by the silent killers. Stress and health issues. On October 10, 1980, William was found dead in his Los Angeles apartment. He was only 49 years old. The cause was a sudden heart attack, but many of those close to him felt like the timing was especially cruel. Just a few months before he passed, there was a massive Little Rascals reunion planned, and fans were more excited than ever to see him. There was even a strange, high-profile incident where a man appeared on 2020 claiming to be the real Buckwheat, which forced the actual William Thomas to step into the public eye one last time to defend his identity. The stress of that public controversy, combined with the general health struggles that seemed to plague many former child actors, ended a life that should have had decades left. William died on the exact same day of the year that he had started his career at Hal Roach Studios decades earlier. It was a coincidence so eerie that it made fans wonder if there really was some cosmic script being written for the gang. He wasn't shot in a kitchen, and he wasn't found in a gutter. But dying at 49, after finally finding peace away from the cameras, felt like a different kind of tragedy, a quiet one that proved even the good rascals couldn't always escape the shadows of their youth. William's death left a hole in the hearts of fans, but the shadow was already moving toward another fan favorite who had spent his life fighting much darker demons. Matthew "Stymie" Beard, the long road back from the brink. If there was ever a kid who could steal a scene with just a look, it was Matthew Beard. Known to millions as Stymie, he was famous for that oversized derby hat, a gift from the legendary Stan Laurel, and a wit that was way ahead of his time. Stymie wasn't just a funny kid. He was a master of the double take and the dry one-liner. But when the paycheck stopped coming and the Our Gang set was closed for good, Matthew found out the hard way that Hollywood didn't have much room for a grown-up Stymie. As he moved into his teenage years, the roles dried up, and the transition from being a superstar to a nobody hit him like a freight train. This is where the story takes a dark turn into the world of addiction, a battle that would consume nearly 2 decades of his life. By the time he was a young man, Matthew was spiraling. He struggled with a severe addiction that led him in and out of trouble with the law. He wasn't just another actor looking for work. He was a man living on the edge, spending time in and out of prison for illegal substance-related offenses. It's heartbreaking to think that the kid who brought so much joy to the Great Depression-era audience was spending his own adulthood in such a bleak, lonely cycle. This was the curse at its most grinding. Not a sudden gunshot, but a slow, painful erosion of a person's spirit. He once said that it was the boredom and the loss of identity that drove him toward the needle. When you're at the top of the world at age 7, where do you go at 21? For Matthew, the answer was into the haze of narcotics. But here is where Matthew's story actually becomes one of the most inspiring and then eventually one of the most tragic in the group. In the 60s, Matthew did the impossible. He got clean. He entered a rehabilitation program called Synanon and turned his life completely around. He didn't just stop using, he became a motivational speaker, traveling around and helping others who were trapped in the same cycle he had escaped. He even made a comeback in acting, appearing in shows like Sanford and Son and Good Times. He was the miracle story. He had beaten the addiction, he had beaten the curse, and he was finally enjoying the respect he deserved as a veteran performer. He had reclaimed his name and his life, showing the world that your past doesn't have to define your future. Then, the curse seemed to strike one last time, just when things were looking up. In early 1981, Matthew suffered a massive stroke. He fell down a flight of stairs and sustained head injuries that he simply couldn't recover from. He died on January 8, 1981, at the age of 56. After surviving decades of illegal substance abuse and life on the streets, it felt incredibly unfair that he was taken just as he was starting his second act. His death was a reminder that even when you win the battle against your demons, the physical toll of a hard life can still catch up to you. He was a survivor who ran out of time, leaving fans to wonder what else he could have achieved if he'd had just a few more years. Matthew found peace before the end, but for the next rascal on our list, there was no time for a second act, only a terrifying moment in the clouds. Bobby Wheezer Hutchins, the soldier who never came home. Bobby Hutchins, better known as Wheezer, was the quintessential little brother of the silent and early sound eras of the Rascals. He was the kid with the bowl cut and the confused expressions who always seemed to be trailing behind the older boys. Unlike Alfalfa or Stymie, Bobby's time in the spotlight was strictly a childhood affair. By the time he was 8 years old, his career in movies was essentially over. He went back to public school, lived a relatively normal life in Tacoma, Washington, and eventually faded into the background of American life. There were no scandals, no illegal substance busts, and no public meltdowns. Bobby Hutchins was the kid who did his job, took his bows, and went home to grow up. When World War II broke out, Bobby did what millions of other young American men did. He signed up. He joined the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1943, serving as a private. For a former child star, the military was often a place to find the structure and real-world identity that Hollywood lacked. Bobby wasn't Wheezer in the cockpit of a plane. He was just another airman trying to do his part. He worked hard and eventually moved toward becoming a pilot. By 1945, as the war was nearing its end, Bobby was stationed at Merced Army Airfield in California for advanced flying school. He was only 20 years old, with his whole life ahead of him and a future that had nothing to do with the cameras of his youth. On May 17, 1945, the tragedy struck in the most sudden and violent way possible. During a routine training exercise, Bobby was involved in a mid-air collision. In an instant, the plane was down, and Bobby was gone. There was no long struggle, no slow decline, just a freak accident in the sky that took a young man in his prime. This is the death that many people point to when they talk about a curse, because it felt so random and so cruel. Bobby hadn't done anything wrong. He wasn't living a high-risk lifestyle or chasing fame. He was just a soldier doing his job, and a split-second error in the air ended it all. The irony of Bobby's death is that he survived the cutthroat world of child stardom only to fall victim to the dangers of a world at war. He was 20 years old, the youngest of the major cast members to die. His death hit the community of former child actors hard because it proved that even if you left the industry and lived a good life, you weren't necessarily safe from a tragic end. He didn't die as a forgotten actor. He died as a soldier. But to the fans who still watched his old shorts, he would always be that little kid trying to keep up with the big boys. Bobby's end was a shock to the system. But the next story is perhaps the most heartbreaking because it happened during a simple medical procedure that should have been safe. Darla Hood, the surgery that became a death sentence. If Alfalfa was the king of the Little Rascals, Darla Hood was undoubtedly the queen. With her perfectly curled hair, sweet singing voice, and that girl-next-door charm, she was the object of affection for almost every boy in the gang. Darla joined the series in 1935 and quickly became one of its most essential members, bringing a touch of class and talent to the chaotic clubhouse antics. Unlike some of her co-stars who struggled with the transition to adulthood, Darla actually managed to keep her career moving. She was a gifted singer and moved into the world of music and voiceover work, even forming her own vocal group called Darla Hood and the Enchanters. She was successful, she was working, and she seemed to have avoided the pitfalls of early fame. She was the one who proved that a little rascal could grow up to be a sophisticated, happy adult in the entertainment industry. But as we've seen with this group, tragedy doesn't always come from a lifestyle choice. Sometimes it's just a horrific stroke of bad luck. The year was 1979, and Darla was busy planning a massive Little Rascals reunion. She was 47 years old, still vibrant, and looking forward to celebrating the legacy she had helped create. She went into a North Hollywood hospital for what should have been a relatively minor, routine procedure, an appendectomy. In the modern age of medicine, this is a standard surgery with an incredibly high success rate. However, something went catastrophically wrong. Following the operation, Darla's health began to plummet rapidly. It was later discovered that she had contracted acute hepatitis. The source of the infection was traced back to a tainted blood transfusion she received during the surgery. In an era before the rigorous screening processes we have today, a simple medical necessity turned into a lethal poison. The downfall was swift and brutal. As the hepatitis took hold, her organs began to fail. Darla Hood, the girl who had survived the pressures of Hollywood and built a respectable life, died of heart failure on June 13, 1979. The news sent shockwaves through the fan base and her former castmates. It felt fundamentally wrong. There was no downward spiral or dark secret behind Darla's death, just a medical fluke that felt like a final cruel punchline from the universe. Her death at 47 added a new layer to the curse theory, suggesting that even if you did everything right, the shadow of the gang might still find a way to reach you. She was the sweetheart of the group, and her passing marked the end of an era of hope for many who believed the Rascals could all live to a ripe old age. While Darla's death was a freak accident, the next Rascal on our list lived a life that felt like a slow-motion car crash from the very beginning. Scotty Beckett, the Golden Boy's downward spiral. If you were looking for a child star who had it all, it was Scotty Beckett. With his big, expressive eyes and a mop of curly hair, he was the perfect pretty boy counterpart to the more rugged kids in the gang. He joined our gang in 1934 and was frequently paired with Spanky McFarland, forming one of the most beloved comedic duos in the history of the series. Scotty had that it factor, a natural charm that made him an instant hit with audiences and producers alike. Unlike many of the Rascals, who found their careers dead in the water after leaving the shorts, Scotty actually moved on to even bigger things. He became a major child star at MGM, appearing in massive hits like The Jolson Story and King's Row. He was the rare success story, a kid who transitioned from a scruffy rascal to a polished Hollywood leading man in the making. But as the 40s turned into the 50s, the Golden Boy began to tarnish, and his life became a case study in the destructive power of the Hollywood machine. The decline of Scotty Beckett wasn't a sudden drop. It was a slow, agonizing slide into chaos. As he reached his late teens and early 20s, the pressures of maintaining his status in the industry began to take a heavy toll. He started to struggle with severe alcohol and illegal substance abuse, which led to a string of increasingly violent and bizarre legal troubles. The headlines about his acting were replaced by reports of arrests for drunk driving, carrying concealed weapons, and even a dramatic incident involving a police standoff. He was a man who seemed to be at war with himself, unable to reconcile the sweet image of his youth with the troubled adult he had become. Every time he tried to make a comeback, another scandal would break, pushing him further to the fringes of the industry that had once worshipped him. It was as if the very fame that had sustained him as a child was now the poison that was killing him as a man. By the time 1968 rolled around, Scotty was a shell of his former self. He checked into a Hollywood hotel, battered from a recent physical altercation and exhausted by years of legal and personal battles. On May 10, 1968, he was found dead in his room at the age of 38. While a specific cause of death was debated, some pointed to a massive overdose of barbiturates, while others noted the physical trauma he had recently suffered. The underlying truth was undeniable. Scotty had simply run out of road. There was a goodbye note found at the scene, though its contents were as muddled and tragic as his final years. He didn't die of a freak accident or a sudden illness. He died from the sheer weight of a life lived too fast and too early in the glare of the spotlight. His passing at such a young age solidified the Little Rascals curse in the minds of the public, serving as a grim warning about the cost of childhood fame. Scotty Beckett was a boy who had the world at his feet, only to find that the world could be a very cold place when the cameras stopped clicking. Norman "Chubby" Cheney, the sweet kid who ran out of time. In the world of the Little Rascals, every kid had a specific type, and Norman Cheney was the lovable, gentle giant. Stepping into the role of the heavy after Joe Cobb left the series, Norman, affectionately known as Chubby, captured the hearts of audiences with his polite manners and his surprisingly agile comedic timing. He wasn't just there to be the big kid. He had a genuine sweetness that radiated through the screen. From 1929 to 1931, Chubby was a staple of the gang, appearing in some of the most iconic early talkies. But while his weight was his ticket to fame and his primary comedic hook, it was also a symptom of a much deeper, more dangerous medical issue that the doctors of the 30s weren't fully equipped to handle. Unlike the other rascals who stayed in the industry or moved into other careers, Norman's story is a race against a clock that was ticking much faster than anyone realized at the time. When Norman left the series at the age of 17, he didn't just stop acting, he started growing at an alarming rate. He returned to his hometown of Baltimore, Maryland, and tried to live a normal life. But his health began to fail almost immediately. His weight, which had been around 300 pounds during his time with the gang, ballooned to over 450 pounds. This wasn't just a matter of diet or lifestyle. Norman was suffering from a severe glandular ailment, likely a problem with his pituitary gland, which caused his body to grow uncontrollably. In an era before modern endocrinology, there were very few options for a young man in his position. He was trapped in a body that was essentially working against him, and the fame he had once enjoyed as a child star felt like a lifetime away, as he struggled with the basic physical realities of his condition. It was a lonely, painful existence for a boy who had once been the center of attention in Hollywood. By 1935, Norman's situation had become desperate. He underwent a groundbreaking, yet incredibly risky surgery at Johns Hopkins Hospital to try and correct the glandular disorder. Initially, the surgery seemed like a success. His weight plummeted from 450 pounds down to a much healthier 140 pounds in a very short period. But the massive, rapid weight loss took a catastrophic toll on his weakened heart and his overall constitution. Norman "Chubby" Cheney never truly recovered from the procedure. He grew weaker and weaker, and on May 29, 1936, he passed away at the age of only 21. He was the first of the major Little Rascals to die, and his death was a somber wake-up call to the public. He died in a hospital bed in Baltimore, far from the bright lights of Los Angeles, leaving behind a legacy of laughter that stood in stark contrast to the physical suffering of his final years. Because he died so young and so soon after leaving the show, Norman is often cited as the first victim of the curse. His story is particularly tragic because he was a victim of his own biology, a kid whose very physical traits were exploited for entertainment, while they were simultaneously destroying his health. There was no scandal, no addiction, and no violence, just a young man who was let down by the medical science of his day. He was buried in an unmarked grave for decades until fans eventually raised the money to give him a proper headstone in 2012. It took almost 80 years for the world to truly honor the boy who gave so much of himself to the screen. With so many heartbreaking endings, it's easy to believe the curse was real, but what about the rascals who defied the odds? Breaking the curse of the playground. After hearing about shootings, overdoses, and medical tragedies, it's easy to walk away thinking that being a little rascal was a one-way ticket to a dark ending. But if we only look at the tragedies, we miss the most important part of the story: the survivors. For every Alfalfa or Scotty Beckett, there was a Jackie Cooper or a Jean Darling who lived long, vibrant, and incredibly successful lives. Jackie Cooper, for instance, didn't just survive Hollywood, he conquered it. He lived to be 88 years old, transitioning from a child star to a powerhouse director and executive. Then there was Dorothy DeBorba, the girl with the echo voice, who lived a perfectly happy life as a clerk and died at 85. Jean Darling moved to Ireland, became a mystery novelist, and lived to the ripe old age of 93. And we can't forget Mildred Cornman, who lived to be 97, spending her life as a photographer and model, far away from the curse that supposedly haunted her childhood friends. The reality is that the Little Rascals curse is more of a mathematical certainty than a supernatural hex. When you have a cast of over 40 children working together over 2 decades, the law of averages says that some will face tragedy while others will find peace. We focus on the sad endings because they make for a more gripping story, but the truth is much more human. The Little Rascals weren't cursed. They were just people. They were kids who were thrust into a high-pressure industry during a rough time in history, and they grew up to face the same triumphs and heartbreaks as the rest of us. The fact that so many of them lived into their 80s and 90s proves that there was no dark shadow looming over the clubhouse. In the end, the real legacy of the Little Rascals isn't how they died, it's how they lived, and the timeless laughter they left behind for generations of fans. If you want more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.